This is Access 2016, Module 6 and 7, Part 1. In this segment, we're going to be looking at creating a form in Design View. So we're going to begin by getting into our Care Center database. So I already have the Care Center database open. I've closed up the queries just so you could see the other information easier. If you do not have all the queries that we added when we were working through Module 5, that is not going to cause you any problems on this segment. You simply need to have your billing table. Okay, so as long as you have the table set up, you will be fine. We're going to start out on the Create tab. So I'm going to click on Create. And if you want to start a form in Design View, you're going to choose the Form button that has the word Design in it. So that's what we're going to choose. One term that you'll see on the exams and on database sources is a control. So a control is any item that you can add to a form. And today we're going to explore 3 types of controls that we can add to our form. Bound controls, unbound controls, and calculated controls. And I will go ahead and explain each of those as we're working with the form and adding the information. So the first thing that we're going to do when we start creating a form is we are going to add fields from one of our tables. So we're going to begin by clicking on, in the Design tab, the Add Existing Fields button in the Tools group. That will come up to a field list. Yours probably does not show. There you go. This is what yours should look like. You want to click the Show All Tables button. That will give you a list of all the tables that are available for you to choose your data from. We are going to use the billing table. So we're going to click the plus next to billing table, and it will show us a list of the available fields. If we double click on these fields, it will add them in the order that we select them. So we're going to start out with the visit ID, and then we're going to choose the invoice number. Then I want you to double click to choose each of the fields scrolling down. So all you do to add these fields is double click on them. So I double clicked on visit ID, then invoice number. Next, I'm going to choose the date, the amount, item ID, invoice paid, and insurance. So once we're done adding fields, we can close this list pane. We don't need that open anymore. And now we can save our form so that we keep our starting point. So we're going to click Save, and we're going to call it FRM Billing. Now we want to look at how we can move these fields around, maybe resize some of the information, and delete items that we might not need. So we're going to start by moving this invoice paid, and I would like it up next to the invoice number. So I click on invoice paid checkbox, and then I'm going to drag it up here and put it next to the invoice number. Now, one thing I did forget to mention is that when we add these fields, it adds 2 objects. The first one, this box is where the data that is entered into the table will be displayed, and this is called the field box. Next to the field box, it has a label box. This label box is considered to be a bound control. It's called a bound control because it is linked to the data that is stored in the table. If we open up our billing table and we switch to design view, you'll see that in insurance there is no caption. So what is displayed in our label box is the field name of insurance. However, if we look at visit ID, you can see that in this case there is a caption and that it added a space. And so when we come back to our table, or excuse me, our form, you can see that it put the caption in where there's a caption. It puts the field name in as the default where there is not a caption entered. So this information is being pulled from your table design that you did earlier in the different modules. All right, so now that I have moved this invoice paid, I want all of these options, the invoice number, label, the invoice number text, the invoice paid text, and the invoice paid label, I want them to all line up along the same line on the tops of their boxes. So I'm going to do a right click and choose Align and say Top. And you can see it did shift the checkbox up a little bit to line them all up. Now the next thing I can do is I can enlarge a text box. So for example, if I look at the invoice item ID, the information that is in that table is probably not going to fit in that small box. So I need to resize it. Now if you notice, if I hover over it and I get a cross with the arrows, that cross indicates you are moving the entire box. You're not going to be resizing it. In order to resize, you have to hover over one of these little squares, which are called resizing handles. If you get the arrows left to right, it is going to allow you to enlarge it or shrink it left to right. The same way over these center boxes here in the bottom. The up and down arrows allow you to make it larger or smaller by dragging it up or down. If you want to be able to do both at the same time, you want to grab this corner where you get a diagonal arrow. That allows us to make it larger by dragging it down and also by dragging it out at the same time. So now I'm going to save those changes. And the last thing we're going to change when it comes to the div fields is we don't want the visit ID field. If you click on the text box and delete the field, it will delete the text box and the label box that is associated with it. If you only want to delete the label box, then you would click on the label box. When you delete that, it will leave the text box there. If you chose the wrong one and you meant to delete everything, but it only deleted the label, then you simply have to click and do a second delete. However, if you do a right click on the text box and choose delete, it takes both of them off in one step. so we'll save you time. Let's go ahead and save that change again. Okay, so now we're ready to start adding some things like a title, or maybe a label, perhaps a logo. These items are called unbound controls. That is because they are not directly linked to data that is stored in your database. So we're going to go ahead and start out by adding a title. So in the Form Design tab, I'm going to choose the button that says Title in the header and footer group. You can see that the title that was defaulted in was the form name that we used when we saved it. We just want to get rid of FRM, and we're going to call it Billings, add it plural. When I'm done typing, I can click anywhere else. And then if I want to go back and make changes, I can highlight the text and go to the Format tab. I could make it bold. I could maybe change the color if I wanted to. So let's make this a different color. So we'll just pick this dark blue. And now you can see it changed that, and we also made it bold. When you add an item into the form, header or footer, you'll notice when you scroll down, you get a footer and you get a header. You get them both at the same time. So when you're adding unbound controls to your form, you want to be careful that you pay attention to where they ask you to add it. So for example, if I needed to add a logo, so I'm going to click on logo, and I'm going to locate the picture. This came from your Q drive, so it should be out in your access files that came from your Q drive. So these are the ones that came from your Q drive. In the Access 2016, and then in the Access 2016 modules, you should find an animal.png graphic. We'll open that, and you can see that it gave us a logo. If we wanted to resize that, again, you want to make sure that you go to Layout and remove the layout. That separates the logo from the label. I am going to shrink down the size of that title. And again, I'm going to remove the layout. And that way I can move my picture. If you don't remove the layout, it is resizing and moving everything. So again, you can resize that picture, put it wherever you want, but you have to remove the layout first. Now let's also take a look at how we could add a footer. We're going to add a label into our footer. So if you scroll all the way down to the bottom, you'll notice you have an area here called the footer. It will enlarge as you add something to it. So we are going to choose the button in our control group that when you hover over it, it says label. I'm going to click on label. Then I'm going to come down here into my footer and I'm going to draw out the shape of my label. When you release the mouse, it enlarges the size of the footer to fit the label that you had. We're going to type the text in our label that says prepared by and then your name. When you're done typing, click away from the label. Then you can click back on the label and highlight the text if you wanted to make some formatting changes. So for example, I'm going to go to the Format tab, and in the font color group, I am going to make this dark red. I'm maybe also going to increase the size. And then I'm going to, since it went to 2 lines, I'm going to increase the size of the actual label so it goes back to 1 line. And then one thing I could do is I could also, if I wanted to, add a fill color. So we're going to pick this first gold color. And notice then it would fill in the box with that color. We could also make our letters here bold if we wanted them darker. And now you see what your label would look like. So you can see we've added unbound controls in both the header and in the footer. So the last type of control we have to add is a calculated control. But before we do that, let's go ahead and save the changes that we have made. Now we're going to add a calculated control. So in order to do a calculated control, we're going to go back over to our Design tab. And we're going to choose the option for a text box. When you hover over this one, it says text box. The symbols look very similar to the label, but you're going to see a distinct difference in just a few minutes. So we're going to click on text box, and I'm going to come over here underneath invoice paid, but above invoice item, and I'm going to draw out the shape of a box. You'll notice it added 2 items. It added a label box as well as a text box. I'm going to scoot that over a little bit because I don't want that label to cover up the other data. So now you have your label and you have a new field, which is going to be a calculated field or a calculated control. We're going to do that on the property sheet. So with our new text box highlighted, you want to come up and choose property sheet. So we're going to enter a few pieces of information here. We're going to start out by giving it a name. Instead of text 15, yours could say any other number. I mean, it may not say 15, it just depends on how many times fields have been added in this particular access. So if yours says a different number, don't worry about that. We're going to say text, TXT, invoice, AMT, sum. That's the name of our new field. Now in the sum, or excuse me, in the control source, we're going to actually put a formula. So I'm going to say I want this to be equal to the sum, and then open the parentheses, and I'm going to tell it what field to sum up. Invoice, AMT, close the parentheses, and when you tab out of the box, You'll notice it did insert the square brackets for you, but it displays the formula now in your text box. We can also then specify formatting, so I can come down and say it's currency. If I want it to be auto decimals, which would not show trailing zeros after the decimal places, I could leave it auto. Or I could come in here and say I always want to see 2 places after the decimal. After I've specified the formatting, I'm going to go ahead and close my property sheet. Now you'll notice that my label still says text 15. So you have to highlight that data and you need to change it. So we're going to say total all invoices. And then click someplace else on the form so that it knows you're done typing. I'm going to go ahead and save these changes. And then we're going to change from design view up to form view. Now you can see all of the changes that we have made on this particular form. So the last thing we're going to change is something called the tab order. What the tab order is, it's the way you move through the screen or the form as you are hitting the tab key. So you're going to move in the order that they were added onto the form. Okay, so we're going to start with invoice number, and when I tab, it goes to the date, then the amount, and then the invoice item. But since my invoice paid was entered next, it's going to go up to invoice paid before it goes down to insurance, and then it'll stop on invoice, total all invoices. So I want to change my tab order so that it goes all the way down to insurance, then it goes up to invoice paid and down here. Notice one thing, because this is a calculated field, even though it stops here, if you try to type, it does not allow you to type any data there because it is a calculated field. So let's take a look at how we can switch our tab order. So in order to do that, we are going to go back to design view. So I'm going to choose the view arrow and choose design view. And you'll notice on the design tab there is a button here that says tab order. This shows you the order that these fields are going to move through as you tab. I want to move the invoice paid field below the insurance field. So you're going to click on it once to highlight it, then click on it a second time and hold the mouse down. You'll see a dark line. When you start moving, you'll notice as you drag the mouse down, your dark line moves. Place the dark line where you want it, so after insurance, and then release the mouse. Once you have them in the order you want them, go ahead and click OK. Now let's switch back to form view so we can test. And as we tab through, you'll notice it went to insurance, then invoice. So it moves in a more logical order now. One thing to be aware of, your book covers an option called anchoring. The forms that we create, the way we do them, are going to be affected by screen resolution changes. So if it looks this way on my monitor, if I take this same form and open it on a different computer with a different screen resolution setting, it will look different. you may want to have use the technique called anchoring if you know your forms will be used on multiple screen resolution settings. Because what anchoring does is it positions it to a spot on the screen, and no matter what the resolution is, it will still look the same on that other monitor. So that is a technique you can learn about on your own if you are using Access, and it is discussed in your textbook. So I'm going to go ahead and make sure all of our changes are saved. And we're going to close our form. And that concludes modules 6 and 7, part 1, working in Design View.